Hi everyone, so this video is about postmodernism within crime and deviance, and it will actually help you prepare for long essays, so your 20 markers and your 30 markers. So postmodernism is a topic which we study within crime and deviance. We'll also study it in religion and beliefs when we do it next term. Now, it's really important with this topic that you pay close attention and you make notes. Any core terminology you really need to identify, okay, and highlight it, etc. As ever, the AO3 and the AO2 points I've pointed out for you, so write them down in a different coloured pen. Now, postmodernism, as I've said here, it will help you prepare for longer essays with the 30s and the 20 markers. So over the next 6 months, we're going to start looking at a lot of 30 and 20 marker essay plans, and we're going to do a few essays as well as we go within class to help us get ready for this. So please make sure you take notes. So be detailed as you can, because the examiners will look for detail. Now, first thing to remember is postmodernism is a standalone topic, so it's a separate topic, so you could get a separate question on it. But it's also useful as a topic to evaluate other theories. So you can use postmodernism to evaluate theories like functionalism, feminism, Marxism, labelling, etc. So you'll start to see as I go. So the other thing, obviously, you can rewind, pause, etc. as I go through this. So a theoretical perspective. Now, postmodernism, PM, I've just shortened it down, okay? PM is a core theoretical perspective, just like functionalism, interpretivism. It's a theory. The examiners may kind of use that word theoretical perspective. So functionalism, interpretivism, postmodernism, etc., they are all theoretical perspectives. Postmodernism is one of the big ones. Now, AO3 straight away. So postmodernist theorists, postmodernist sociologists, what they argue is they argue other theories like functionalism and feminism are no longer relevant in today's society, okay? So today's society is very contemporary, it's very diverse, okay? Now, postmodernists argue we live in a pluralistic society now. Now, a pluralistic society has lots of different views. It's a very diverse society. We all have different beliefs. We all have different social norms. Look at the terms I'm using here. So add these to your notes, rewind if you need to. So we all have different social norms, different values, different beliefs. So we are a very pluralistic society, a very diverse society. Now, some more AO3 for you here. Now, postmodernists refer to other theoretical perspectives, and they call them meta-narratives. Okay, so postmodernists would call functionalists and feminists, Marxist labelling theorists, etc. They would call them meta-narratives. So I'm going to explain this term. A meta-narrative literally means a big theory, okay? Now, these big theories have a big kind of belief in their middle. So let's look at this, what I mean. So the meta-narrative of feminism, for instance, it argues that patriarchy is the cause of all oppression. So if you look at labelling as a meta-narrative, it argues social control agencies can label people. That's their meta-narrative. That's their big theoretical point of view. Marxists, their big meta-narrative, their big theory is that capitalism causes all problems. Okay, so postmodernists refer to other theories as meta-narratives, and these other meta-narratives have kind of got a big theory at their heart, at their core. So the meta-narrative for feminism is kind of patriarchy, for Marxism it's capitalism, for instance. Okay, even more AO3. Now, if we were looking at it from a feminist point of view, postmodernists would argue, okay, well, there's not just patriarchy to blame. There's a lot more to the story than that. We live in an incredibly diverse society now. So it could be capitalism as well. It could be labelling as well of women. It could be multiple different things which are causing oppression. So you cannot just blame one big idea. Yeah, you cannot just kind of have this one big idea. So remember, key term here, meta-narrative. So meta-narrative is this idea that There's a big theory that has a big belief in its kind of core. So, as I said, capitalism is the core idea that Marxists blame. Patriarchy is the core social force that feminists blame. Yeah. So these are really key points here. Postmodernists, on the other hand, argue it's not about meta narratives. It's not about meta narratives. We live in a very diverse and a very pluralistic society. Rewind, re listen to this if you need to. Okay, so how do postmodernists explain crime? So, other theories are mainly structural. So, AO3 again, if we look at Marxists, they blame the economic base, they blame capitalism, which is a structure, and they say, okay, it causes crime. Okay? So that's what they argue. Okay, so that's what postmodernists say. Postmodernists say Marxists are blaming capitalism, which is a structure, and that's the cause of crime. Postmodernists are very different. They talk about individual choice. Okay? Now, they say in today's society, we are very diverse, we are very fragmented. So society is kind of broken up into lots of individual people. It's not this kind of mass, which is just like capitalism. It's not this big thing. There's lots of small individual actors that make up society. Listen to what I've just said. So there's lots of small individual actors that make up society, okay? Now, individualism's really high, personal choices are incredibly high in a postmodernist society. That's what postmodernists are arguing. So, postmodernists do not look at patterns of crime, okay? So, for instance, they won't look at how many crimes are caused by capitalism like Marxists would, okay? They would not look at that. Instead, they argue that crime is linked to free will because we're all individual actors, we are all diverse, we all make choices. So they argue, postmodernists, they argue that crime is linked to free will. Okay, remember another term for you here, thinking A star, A, B. Yeah, free will also links to the term voluntaristic. We all make choices. Okay, now some AO2. Remember, there's different kinds of AO2. Some is where you have an item, some is where you give examples, some is where you link different theories together. So, one kind of AO2 is when we link two theories. So, postmodernists are somewhat similar, not entirely. They are somewhat similar to symbolic interactionists or labeling theorists because they all argue, as in labeling and postmodernists, that crime is a personal choice. Okay? So the key thing to take away from this particular slide that we're on right now, is postmodernists don't look at structure. They don't look at kind of the structure of capitalism. They wouldn't argue the structure of capitalism causes people to commit crime. Okay, Marxists would. Postmodernists would argue, okay, it's all about personal choice. We're all individuals. Individually, we have personal choice. It's very voluntaristic. Okay? Now, how do postmodernists define crime? Let's look at this term here. Crime is a really big term to think about. So, crime is actually an outdated concept, the term, according to postmodernists. Now, postmodernists argue that this legal concept, this legal definition of crime, it's no longer relevant. Okay? Now, they argue it's a socially constructed concept. So crime is a socially constructed concept. So remember, this is where some social groups define what is legally and socially acceptable. That's what socially constructed means, okay? So if we look back at labeling theorists, some labeling theorists, they socially construct what is seen as being deviant. So if we looked at the example of marijuana use, for instance, that was socially constructed to be seen as being deviant. Okay? Now, this will all start to make sense in just a few seconds, okay? So, remember, postmodernists argue that crime, the term itself, the legal idea of crime, this is a key point here, yeah? The legal idea of crime is no longer relevant. Okay, so weakening of social ties. So in a postmodern society, we're all very individualistic, okay? Our community ties, so our kind of attachments to our bigger community, our society, yeah? It's weaker. It's much weaker than it's ever been. Now, we put our own needs ahead of anything and anyone else. So we put our own needs above the needs of society. Now, this is an example which is going to hopefully help you think. Okay, now religious extremism obviously is an incredibly destructive force. Okay, and legally it is seen as crime. It is very much legally seen as a crime, but for many people it's not. Okay, so for many people it's not. Religious extremists from their point of view, they see their own views as being much more valid than the rule of law. Okay, so this is just an example for you. So religious extremism is a crime legally, but for many people it's not seen as being wrong. People who are religious extremists see their views as being much more valid than the rule of law. So this is showing you this idea of individualism. This is giving you an example of individualism, that individualism is about personal choice. What we see as being valid may differ from what the law says as being is valid. Okay, so an important point for you here. So postmodernists would therefore argue that there are multiple narratives coexisting. So multiple narratives means multiple stories. There are multiple ways of living. Okay, so we have multiple social norms, multiple beliefs, multiple ways of living. And in a postmodern society, they all exist. So there are multiple ways to be. So re-listen to this particular slide if you need to. So just going back over that example to help you understand it here. So individualism, we all have our own acceptable right or wrong. Okay? So religious extremism is a crime legally, very much so. Obviously, it's an incredibly destructive force. Now, for religious extremists, they would argue, okay, their own views are much more valid than the importance of the rule of law. So this is what postmodernists use as an example to say, look, this legal idea of crime, it's too narrow, okay? So seeing crime as just breaking laws is far too narrow. So listen to what I've just said. Postmodernists would argue that seeing crime purely through a legal point of view is too narrow. And we're going to touch on this in just a second. So postmodernist views about crime prevention and punishment. Okay, social harms. Let's look at this core term. Now, crime involves a very narrow definition of what's right and wrong. Okay, a very narrow definition of what's right or wrong. Postmodernists argue we need a much broader approach to defining what crime is, and obviously then having strategies to deal with crime. So we need a much broader approach in a diverse, pluralistic society, according to postmodernists. We need a much broader approach which is more diverse, which is more pluralistic. So you've got these postmodernist sociologists here. Please remember these are postmodernists. So you've got Henry and Milovanovic. Henry and Milovanovic. Now, Henry and Milovanovic, they believe that the term crime, it needs replacing with a broader term, which is social harm. Okay? So we need to replace the term crime with a broader term, and that broader term is social harm. Now, they argue social harm is much more relevant and it covers broader deviant behaviours than the term crime. Okay? So the term social harm, it's much more relevant in a pluralistic society and it covers broader deviant behaviours than the term crime. Now, there are two kinds of social harms. So these are the two kinds. So one, you've got harms of reduction. Okay, so there are two social kinds of social harms. So there are two social harms. Sorry, I made a typo here. Please remember this. Please remember this. This should say the two social harms. So there's two kinds of social harms. Okay, so there are two kinds of social harms. So first of all, you've got harms of reduction. These are Henry and Milovanovic's theories. So this is where someone uses their power and it causes immediate harm to someone else, such as burglary, theft, or murder. Okay? Now that's obviously very similar to a conventional legal definition of crime. So that's not really that different to a legal definition of crime. Okay. The second kind of social harm is a harm of repression. Now, this is not about the future. This is where someone's future, sorry, this is not about the immediate. This is where someone's future development is impacted. Okay, so this is where someone's future development is impacted. So let's look at this. So this can include when particular cultures are disadvantaged, for example, through racial prejudice. So a certain culture might be disadvantaged, and for instance, because of institutional racism, certain cultures may not be able to get jobs as easily. They may not be able to progress as easily through work. They may have less access to education. Now, these kinds of harms are much more difficult to police. Yeah? So they are broader in terms of what we should be thinking a harm is. So we shouldn't just be thinking about harms in terms of like this legal definition. We should have a much broader definition. So it's about social harms. Okay? Right. How we reduce crimes and social harms. So this is how postmodernists want to reduce crime and social harms. So they want to introduce various strategies to reduce them. Okay, so they want to introduce various strategies to reduce crime and social harms. Now, these could be publicly or governmentally funded, or they could be privately funded by companies, for instance. For example, CCTV, it's often privately funded, and it's a means of reducing crime which postmodernists want. Okay? Now, Foucault, he's a post-structuralist, which is very similar to a postmodernist. Okay? He argues surveillance is a very effective means of reducing crime. Now, what he argues, if people know they are being watched, they are less likely to commit crime. Now, remember here, postmodernists do not value meta-narratives. They don't like them. They don't like one theory which says it's correct. Okay? So postmodernists understand that crime rates will vary according to locality. So certain areas will have higher crime rates, certain areas will have lower crime rates. So for example, an area of deprivation may have high rates of utilitarian crime compared to a more richer or more affluent area. So therefore, if you've got a one-size-fits-all government policy, it's not likely to be effective in reducing crime according to postmodernists. So having a law which is applicable to the whole of the country is not likely to be as effective when it comes to reducing crime. Okay? Postmodernists say that one-size-fits-all laws, so remember that's where a law is applicable to the whole country, it's too general. Okay? You've got to have specific laws for specific areas. Okay, that might be an idea. Okay, let's look at this concept of liquid surveillance. Okay, let's talk about this now. Okay, so your key sociologists here are Bauman and Lyon. Bauman and Lyon, they are postmodernists, worked together, Bauman and Lyon. So there's different forms of surveillance. Okay, believe it or not, we use one all the time, mobile phones. Mobile phones are actually a key form of surveillance. Now, we're very willing to purchase and use mobile phones. All of us are, okay? Now, what do mobile phones tell us about surveillance? They tell us that surveillance is actually becoming transparent. So let's look at what this means. It's in effect liquid and invisible to us, okay? Hence liquid surveillance. Okay, we all use mobile phones all the time, but how often do we think they could be used for surveillance? Very rarely, if at all. So we are generally really unaware of how much mobile phones are being used for surveillance by the state or the government. Okay, now what about the rights to privacy? We obviously pick up our phones and we always assume that we've got a right to privacy. It's a kind of right by law, that's what we think. Now, the fact that we're using mobile phones all the time without worrying about surveillance, it tells us that we've moved on in our beliefs from thinking that we have a right to privacy to thinking that we actually have nothing to fear. So even though people might be using mobile phones and we're kind of using them without acknowledging or even thinking about the fact that mobile phones might be used for surveillance, okay, we now have moved to this kind of belief that, okay, we've got nothing to fear, the government's kind of not abusing their power, etc., etc. Okay? So, postmodernists argue that surveillance is now a form of social control. Okay? So, they are now arguing that surveillance is actually a form of social control. The fact that we don't even think about mobile phones as being a form of surveillance, and the fact that we think, okay, it's just this idea that we've got nothing to fear. Postmodernists argue we've moved to a point now where surveillance is actually a form of social control. Key term there. Re-listen to things if you need to, okay? You've got the advantage that you can rewind this. Now, AO3 of postmodernism, let's AO3 it, okay? All AO3. So strengths of it. Okay, this would be very useful with an evaluation 30 marker, which we're going to start looking at soon. So, postmodernists are correct in pointing out that legal definitions of crime are too narrow for a pluralistic world. They are very correct in that. They also show us how our lives are much more pluralistic. They also show us that meta-narratives or big theories may be of limited use in a diverse world. They tell us this, okay? That meta-narratives, remember that's a big theory, they are of limited use in a diverse world. Now, there's some weaknesses of postmodernism as well. So it fails to tackle or even acknowledge structural inequalities like capitalism. So postmodernism would be criticised by Marxism. They would say, okay, yes, you're talking about this idea that there's lots of ways to live, but you're not addressing big structural inequalities like capitalism. Secondly, when we refer to social harms, okay, postmodernists don't really have a very valid way of defining what a harm is. It's not a very valid way. Yeah. So when we look at Henry and Milovanovic's definitions, they are not kind of all-encompassing. They don't cover every kind of social harm. Okay. So those definitions can lack clarity. Now, postmodernists ignore selective enforcement. So they ignore the fact that certain social groups are targeted by social control agencies. They ignore that. So they don't look at structural inequality. So again, they'd be criticised by, say, Marxists or feminists, for instance. Okay. Lastly, this one is a bit stranger to think about, but even postmodernism is a meta-narrative. Postmodernism's main belief is that there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of ways to live. That's a big idea as well. In and of itself, that's a big idea. Just like capitalism is a meta-narrative for Marxists, yeah, and Marxism is a meta-narrative, feminism is a meta-narrative, yeah, even postmodernism is a meta-narrative. We all have hundreds, if not, there's thousands of ways to live. Even that's a big theory, that's a big story, okay? Now, takeaway messages from this. You can re-listen to it if you need to. Now, other theorists on meta-narratives, Marxism sees capitalism as a problem, feminism sees patriarchy as a problem, yeah? Now, there are now multiple narratives, okay? So there is multiple ways to live now, according to postmodernists. Key takeaway message. Make sure your notes are thorough, go back over it if you need to, okay? Now, in the next video, which I'm going to post next week, we're going to start looking at structuring 30 markers. Thank you very much.